Dominoes. Level 3. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button and Other Stories. By F. Scott Fitzgerald. Text adaptation by Claire West. Read by Francine Brody, David Menken, Rhonda Miller, Eric Myers, Martin T. Sherman, and Becca Stewart. Published and copyright Oxford University Press, 2011.
The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, Part 1. In 1860, Roger Button and his wife were living in Baltimore, USA. Mrs. Button was in hospital, waiting to have her first baby. Mr. Button hoped they would have a son because he wanted to send him to Yale, one of the two most important colleges in the United States. Harvard is the other. He himself had studied at Yale. On the morning the baby was expected to arrive, Mr. Button got up early and hurried to the hospital. As he arrived, he saw Dr. Keene, their family doctor, leaving.
Dr. Keene?
Mr. Button called.
Oh, Dr. Keene!
The doctor turned and looked strangely at him.
What happened?
Asked Mr. Button excitedly.
Is it a boy? How is my wife? Tell me, is the child born?
Dr. Keene said darkly,
Well, you could say the child is born, in a way.
He gave Mr. Button another strange look.
Is it a boy or a girl?
Now look here.
Cried Dr. Keene, suddenly very angry.
Go and see for yourself. It's most curious. I've never seen a case like it. And it's too bad. What about my good name as a doctor? You didn't think of that, did you?
What's the matter?
Asked Mr. Button, by now very worried.
Go and see, and find yourself another doctor. I'm finished with you.
He turned and walked away very fast. Mr. Button could not think what had happened. He slowly went into the hospital and spoke to the first nurse he met.
Good morning,
he said.
I am Mr. Button.
The girl gave a frightened scream.
Upstairs!
She cried, showing him the stairs.
Go up!
Mr. Button went upstairs, where he met another nurse.
I'm Mr. Button,
he said.
I want to see my child.
The nurse looked at him in disgust.
Come with me, Mr. Button,
she said, and took him to a large room with a number of newborn babies, each in its small cot.
Well, which is mine?
Asked Mr. Button.
There,
said the nurse, showing him one of the cots. An old man who looked about 70 years old was sitting in a cot which was much too small for him. He had a large white blanket round him. His thin hair was almost white, and he had a long gray beard.
Am I crazy?
Shouted Mr. Button angrily.
Or are you playing some kind of game with me?
It doesn't seem like a game to us,
said the nurse crossly.
But I can promise you that's your child.
Mr. Button hid his face in his hands.
What will people say?
He whispered.
What must I do?
You must take him home,
said the nurse.
Immediately.
Suddenly, the old man said, in a thin, high voice,
Look here. If you think I'm going to walk home in this blanket, you're making a big mistake. And the clothes they've got for me here, well, they're much too small.
What shall I do?
Mr. Button asked the nurse.
Go and buy your son some clothes.
She replied. It was difficult for Mr. Button to find the right thing. Baby's clothes were too small, and boy's clothes were not suitable for a baby. In the end, he bought a fancy dress boy's suit and ran back to the hospital with it. The old man took one look at it and said,
I don't want people to laugh at me.
Well, they're going to laugh at me,
replied Mr. Button angrily.
Now put it on at once, or there'll be trouble.
All right, Father. You know best. Just as you say.
The sound of the word father suddenly gave Mr. Button a really unpleasant surprise. Was this man, with his gray beard, his watery eyes, and his old yellow teeth, really his baby's son? During the next few days, Mr. Button had his son's beard shaved off, his hair dyed an unnatural black, and clothes made specially for him. Mr. Button bought all kinds of toys, ordering his son to play with them, although it was clear that the old man was not really interested. When people in Baltimore heard about Benjamin, they talked about nothing else for months. Benjamin himself was as puzzled as everyone else.
Why do I look and feel so old?
He wondered. He spent most of his time at home, reading books and secretly smoking his father's cigars. By the time he was 12 years old, he still looked old. But one day, Benjamin looked in his mirror and discovered that under the dye, his hair was gray, not white, and that his skin looked healthier. When he was 18, he had a straight back like a man of 50. He had more hair, and it was dark gray. So his father made him take the examination to enter Yale College. And Benjamin was accepted. He was invited to see Mr. Hart, the registrar.
Good morning,
said Mr. Hart.
You've come to discuss your son, I suppose?
No,
said Benjamin.
I'm Benjamin Button.
Now, Mr. Button, you don't expect me to think that's true.
Benjamin gave a tired smile.
I'm 18,
he said. The registrar pointed angrily at the door.
Get out of here,
he said.
You're crazy and dangerous.
Benjamin left the office. On his miserable walk to the train station, he was followed by a large crowd of college students. They laughed and shouted at him.
Ha! Call yourself 18? You're more like 50.
This isn't an old people's home, you know.
Go to Harvard, why don't you?
Benjamin walked faster, and soon he was running.
I'll show them,
he thought.
I will go to Harvard, and then they'll be sorry.
Safely on the train for Baltimore, he put his head out of the window.
You'll be sorry for this,
he shouted. The students laughed. It was the biggest mistake that Yale College ever made. In 1880, Benjamin was 20, and he went to work in his father's business. That year, his father took him to several fashionable dances. Roger was now 50, and he and his son looked just like brothers. One night in August, they drove to a dance at a country house. It was a lovely evening with a full moon. Just as they arrived, they saw a family getting out of a carriage. A lady, an older man, then a beautiful young woman. As soon as Benjamin saw her, his heart suddenly began to beat loudly. It was first love. The evening seemed awfully long to Benjamin until it was time for his dance with the young lady, Hildegard Moncrief. But when the moment came and he held her in his arms, he felt that his life was just beginning.
"I like older men,"
she told him.
"Young boys are so stupid. They tell me how much they drink at college and how much money they lose when they play cards. I think it's better for me to marry a man of 50 who will take care of me than to marry a man of 30 and take care of him."
6 months later, the people of Baltimore heard the surprising news that Hildegard Moncrief was engaged to marry Benjamin Button. Her worried father told everyone,
It's terrible for a lovely girl like my daughter to throw herself into the arms of a 50-year-old.
People asked each other,
Is she really going to marry Benjamin? And if she does, will they be happy together?
The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, Part 2. Hildegard married Benjamin, and at first they were very happy. As the manager of his father's business, Benjamin made a lot of money. Soon the people of Baltimore stopped whispering about the way he looked, and even Hildegard's parents accepted him. By 1895, Benjamin was really enjoying life. He owned a large, comfortable house, and he was also the first man in Baltimore to own a car.
He seems to grow younger every year,
his friends used to say. They wished they looked half as healthy as he did. There was only one thing that worried Benjamin. His wife did not attract him anymore. She was now a woman of 35, with a 14-year-old son called Roscoe. As the years passed, her bright hair became a boring brown, and she showed no interest in going to parties or dances.
The sad fact is, she's getting older,
Benjamin said to himself. He felt more and more unhappy at home. At the beginning of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Benjamin joined the army and was away from Baltimore for 3 years. He loved the exciting life he led in the army, but he had to return to manage his business. When he arrived home, he was shocked to discover how much older Hildegard looked. He himself looked like a young man of 30. For a moment, he was frightened.
What will happen to me in the future?
He wondered.
How can I go on getting younger?
His wife was angry with him.
Why do you try to look so young?
She asked him crossly.
You could stop it, you know.
But Hildegard, I can't help it.
You just want to be different from other people,
she replied.
Well, that's up to you.
And from then on, they did not spend much time together. To make matters worse, he found that he enjoyed going out and meeting new people more than ever. He was at all the Baltimore parties, talking to the prettiest young women and making them laugh, while his wife sat with the old ladies, looking at him with sad, puzzled eyes.
Look,
the other guests used to say.
That poor young man tied to a woman of 45. He must be 20 years younger than her.
They forgot what their parents had said about these same two people back in 1880.
Look at that lovely young girl. She shouldn't marry a man who's so much older than her.
Benjamin tried not to think about his growing unhappiness at home. He had many new interests to keep him busy. He started playing golf, and he learnt all the newest dances. Every young man in town wished he could play golf and dance as well as Benjamin. Because he went out so often, he found that he was spending less and less time at the office. But he said to himself,
I've worked hard in this business for 25 years. Now it's time to hand it over to young Roscoe. Then I'll really be able to enjoy myself.
His son Roscoe had recently graduated from Harvard. He looked very like Benjamin, and people often mistook them for each other. One September day in 1910, a man who looked about 20 years old was accepted as a first-year student at Harvard University. He did not tell the registrar that he would never see 50 again, or that his son had graduated 10 years before. He started studying and did well in his class. But his greatest success was on the football field. He was chosen to play for his university, and in the game against Yale, he played better than anyone else, and with a cold, hard anger. He was the reason why Yale was beaten so badly, and why 11 Yale players were carried unconscious from the field. All that year, he was the most famous man at Harvard. The next year, he played for Harvard again, although everyone said he seemed smaller. The following year, he wasn't strong enough to be chosen. He looked about 16 years old. When he graduated in 1914, he went home to Baltimore. Hildegard was now living in Italy, so he went to live with Roscoe. He did not get a very enthusiastic welcome. Roscoe was now married and an important person in Baltimore, so he did not want people to talk about his surprisingly young-looking father. In 1920, Roscoe's first child was born. There was a little boy who seemed about 10 years old, living in the house at the time. Nobody explained that he was the new baby's grandfather. 5 years later, Roscoe took his own son and little Benjamin to the kindergarten together. Benjamin had a very happy year or two there, but then he began to feel afraid of the other boys because they were bigger. He was taken away from the kindergarten as Roscoe's son moved up to the next class. Now his nursemaid, Nana, became the center of his little world. On sunny days, they walked in the park, and on wet days, they played games indoors. At the end of the long day, at 5 o'clock, he used to go upstairs with Nana and eat baby food with a spoon. The past did not enter his untroubled, childish sleep. He did not remember his young wife, whom he had loved, or his time fighting bravely for his country, or his days playing football at college, or the parties where he broke so many girls' hearts. There were only the white, safe walls of his cot, and Nana, and a man who came to see him sometimes, and a great orange ball that Nana called Sun. He remembered nothing. When he was hungry for his milk, he cried, and that was all. And then his white cot, and the faces that moved above him, and the warm, sweet smell of his milk disappeared, and it was all dark.